Um, Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the first CCFG webinar of 2022. My name's Bill Mason. I'm the chair of the Continuous Cover Forestry Group, and I'll be your moderator for today's talk. It's a pleasure to welcome a colleague from my days in forest research, Dr. Jens Haufe. Jens did his forestry training in Germany, and he first came to Britain in 2001 to work at Bangor University on the Tyfiant Coed project, which was looking at the potential for continuous cover forestry in Sitka spruce and birch, amongst other things. Jens was working with an illustrious team there at Bangor, including Arne Pomeranian, Owen Davis, and Stephen Murphy, and others. At the end of the Tyfiant Coed project, Jens joined the Forestry Commission, as I think it then still was, as a trainer in learning and development. And then in 2016, we were reckoning a few minutes ago, he came to FR to act as a silvicultural trainer, and he's now the head of technical development. This afternoon's talk, I think, brings together two of Jens's silvicultural passions or interests, namely continuous cover forestry and forest development types. And I'm looking forward with great interest to hearing what he's going to say about using forest development types to introduce continuous cover forestry. Jens, it's over to you.
Okay, thank you, Bill, for your kind introduction. Good afternoon and welcome everyone on this talk on forest development types. I shall go straight away into sharing my screen, and hopefully that has worked for everybody so you can follow my presentation. I should maybe add to Bill's introduction of myself that when I joined Forestry Commission as a trainer, the very first training course I delivered was site recognition and tree species selection. That was back in 2008, and back then it struck me as a bit odd that we were not really looking much at establishing mixtures or mixed stands, certainly not on the National Forest estate. So boosting forest resilience in a changing climate, yeah, the forest development type is really an approach to introduce and use stands and use continuous cover forestry to a much larger degree. Right, but with that, I'm going straight into it. The following topics I'm going to touch in. So I'll start obviously with the need for change, and then I spend quite some time on half an hour on going through the concepts, the features, and some examples of forest development types. There's, I think, one slide on future developments which we expect. And then we'll have about half an hour or so for discussions, questions, and answers. So the rationale for introducing this concept is unsurprisingly climate change. We know it's happening. We know for a lot of us, future climates will hold warmer conditions. For quite a few of us, there will also be considerably drier conditions. Weather may also be more unsettled from a wind climate. And all that, it doesn't just challenge our species choice or provenance choice, it also challenges the way of traditional forest management in the UK, mostly through the secondary effects of climate change, the onslaught of pests and diseases, insect calamities, often facilitated and exacerbated by climatic extremes like wind throw. So it is not just a question, do we pick our tree species or provenances 4 degrees further south in the future, but how can and how should we change the way we manage forests? The list of recommendations to mitigate climate change or to address the risks of climate change for forest management It does include using a wider range of tree species and provenances. It also includes scaling operations down, so using more low impact management approaches and, of course, mixtures. The trouble is, of course, we have mixtures come in many shapes and forms, and we have actually precious little experience in managing these in the UK forestry sector as large. Generally, productive forestry in the UK is really has gone down the road of patch clear felling on a fairly large scale, managing big even-aged swathes of monocultures. It's not that we've never looked at mixtures at all, but if we are a bit self-critical, we'll have to say attempts in the past, they have either been focusing on nurse crop mixtures where the intention never was to really go or establish mixed and self-sustaining stands, or some other approaches have been abandoned later. If you think about more southern scenarios, it was common practice to underplant oak with beech or something else. 50 to 80 years into the rotation, we've walked away from that. Now, these days, we have dire need to diversify our forests in all respects, and we, at the same time, we have pretty much lost the ability, the skills, the expertise to go for mixtures or even for structural diversity as in continuous cover forestry. And that is why we have gone for this, forest development type concept, which we see as an integrated approach, which could help to manage mixed stands, uneven aged stands. We have left options open for what you might say business as usual forestry. So forest development types, they do of course include pure stands, but they also include mixtures. They also include native woodland types. They include uneven aged stands as well as even aged stands. So we have really tried to produce something that is fit for all purposes and that doesn't discriminate against any particular method. The concept is not new. It is being used or has been used for decades in Central Europe. Certainly during my time at a German university, we were taught about forest development type. Similar concepts are in place in Poland, Czech Republic, Austria, Switzerland. The concept was introduced to Denmark about 10 years ago for various similar reasons. We are thinking about using it in the UK now, namely climate change. We did look, I have to admit, probably my fault, we looked to Germany when we looked for a template, more precisely to Lower Saxony, which is the big bright green blob in the northwest of the country. We picked Lower Saxony for two reasons. The first reason was a climatic one. The country is very conveniently located between the North Sea and the Harz Mountains, which rise up to 1,100 meters in altitude. So on a reasonably short distance of 160 miles, you get a range of climatic conditions which come probably closest of what you can find in Germany to the climatic conditions present in the UK. The other reason was that Lower Saxony had a fairly clear and straightforward template of their forest development type. Before I show you what it looks like, one more thing about the general idea. Forest development types, really, they describe the forest as we imagine it to look like towards the end of the rotation or towards the time of final harvesting. So when a self-sustaining forest is in place, so it's the target forest structure. And the forest development type, it is composed of three elements. First, of course, a description, which species are involved and how are they arranged in terms of vertical and horizontal stand structure, age structure of the stand. The other two components are, of course, the ecological suitability. So where does an FDT belong in terms of climatic, soil suitability? How closely is it related to what you might consider the natural vegetation types? So NVC woodland types are usually mentioned there. And of course, it lists the management objectives. So the ambitions we have in terms of economic, environmental, and other benefits of the FDT. Right, I said Lower Saxony offered a fairly clear template. This is what it looks like. At the top, you've got the title and the species involved, so sessile oak, beech, and hornbeam in this instance, followed by a description. On the original template, it is just a verbal description which describes how you have to imagine the stand to look like. From experience in Denmark, we knew that they might benefit from a visualization, so we thought we could possibly come up with something like that, a visual prescription of the stand structure. The description, of course, includes the species proportions once it is fully instated, and the mixture type, so the spatial arrangement of the individual components. The ecological suitability is, well, on the original, again, it is just a short paragraph which outlines where it belongs in terms of climate and soil characteristics and how closely it is related to NVC types. Again, this could be supported by, for example, showing a footprint on a soil fertility, soil moisture matrix. And finally, we've got the management objectives, which are usually divided into the economic ones. So timber is usually specified in terms of quality grading, target diameter, and rotation window. And on the other side, we've got the environmental and social benefits. There's no ranking involved. It's usually they're grouped like that because environmental and social benefits can more conveniently be described verbally in a short paragraph. So that is the way the template from Lower Saxony looked like. An FDT easily fits onto an A4 page and just provides a lot of condensed information about the woodland structure. We thought in developing our own version for the UK, we first had to come up with a kind of hierarchy or a numbering scheme. So we went for a 3-digit approach. The first digit specifies the category. So there's 10 categories. 1 is for spruces, 2 is for light demanding conifers, 3 is for Pacific Northwest American conifers. We singled them out because we thought they merited a special place because of their suitability to the maritime climate in the UK. Then we have other conifers, and then we move to the broadleafs. So there's a category for oaks, 1 for beeches, 1 for birches, and the remainder of the broadleafs are just split into long-lived broadleafs, that's number 8, and short-lived broadleafs, which are not any of the species mentioned before. So long-lived, you could imagine that's your sweet chestnut, your sycamore, your ash. Short-lived, that's your rowan, aspen, poplar, willow. We have left a category open for specific management objectives. So there is a category which is not driven by species. The second digit now shows the primary species. So 1.1 is everything dominated by Sitka spruce. Then we have a category 1.2 for Norway spruce, then come the pines, then comes Douglas fir, and you'll see how it's not the complete list here, but you get the idea. 5.1 is then pedunculate oak, 5.2 sessile oak, 5.3 could be any or either of those 2 oaks. And the third digit is either for the secondary species, or if there is none, it's about the age structure. So we have 2 single species FDTs for Sitka spruce, an even-aged one and an uneven-aged one. And then we have mixtures. So there's a type for Sitka and Douglas, a type for Sitka and light demanding conifers, Sitka and shade tolerant conifers. Again, we singled out Sitka spruce and beech, mainly because we knew there was a continental equivalent on Norway spruce and beech, which is quite an important type there. And we saw the potential that beech could play in boosting diversity in Sitka forests. And then, of course, there's Sitka and other broadleafs, long-lived or short-lived. And then the pattern starts to repeat itself with Norway spruce. It's not the same pattern for every single species, but where it appeared appropriate, we just kept to that, what we thought logical approach. The components of FDTs, there's two. The main part is the FDT flashcards. That is basically one card identifies one FDT. So that is a compilation of the forest development types. And that is supported by an FDT guide, which is, well, in essence, it's your user manual. Flashcards, there's a lot of information condensed on very little space. That means we had to use some acronyms. There was no space to explain about silvicultural concepts, etc. So all these things are explained in the guide, together, of course, with a general introduction of the FDT concept and its application. And with that, I'm going to dive into the flashcards. So this is what they look like. It starts with a visualization of the stand structure. There is a short text paragraph on stand structure and dynamics. We have given a range of management options. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. The ecological suitability is covered by a text paragraph, and then, of course, the soil fertilities, soil moisture chart with the footprint of the FDT, and the same for UK climate zones. And the last bit on the front side is the management objectives. On the reverse side, we thought we might as well spend one entire sheet of A4 on an FDT, so printed double-sided. So on the reverse side, there is a short paragraph on management principles. And for most FDTs, there is a management timetable. We simply recognize the lack of experience in general term on managing mixtures, on managing uneven aged sites. So really the intention was to give a bit additional silvicultural support, how these FDTs should be managed. They are available, I should say, on Forest Research website is a category for in the tools and resources section on forest development types. So all the flashcards and the guide can be downloaded from there. That is maybe said a bit too much. We are struggling with the last technicalities because it is obviously a requirement to make everything fully accessible. And some of the highly visual content is quite difficult to fulfill these criteria. But for the time being, when they're not downloadable, if you really are desperate to get your hands on them, you can send me an email. We're quite happy to send them out. But a bit more on the details of the flashcard design. The titles are color-coded, so according to the species, to make them more easily recognizable. Everything that is category 1.1, in other words, based on Sitka spruce, comes with the same title band in the same shade of green. The visualization, straightforward, not overly sophisticated, but I think good enough to give people an idea about how we envisage that the stand might look in the future. The same goes for structure and dynamics. There's a little bit of information on species distribution, so starting with primary species, followed by secondary species and minor species, and usually a sentence or two on likely management approaches. So low impact management, CCF, figure quite strongly there. We have invented this stand structure indicator. There's usually 4 options, very often 2 or 1 or 2 are grayed out. There is a bit more about these. You can quite clearly see that clear fill and restock management. This is what we envisage on the left-hand side of your options. CCF clearly covers the 2 sections on the right. Low impact management approaches are kind of connecting the 2 and overlapping with both of them. So, and as I said, FDTs, they are not always singles, mixed species. Some of them are single, some of them are even-aged, a lot of them are uneven-aged. So there is, however, quite a big steer, or you could say bias, towards CCF. If you look at the number of FDTs which apply to each of these management objectives, only 19 are really fit to be used for, let's say, even-aged, or where there is an option for even-aged stands which you don't even thin. The bulk of them is really even-aged, thinned, but even more of them are supposed to be managed via uneven-aged concepts, either simple or complex structure. So one way or another of continuous cover forestry. In the worst case, we would still say, yeah, low impact management is an acceptable option. So what we've tried really is not to put off old style hard-nosed production foresters who are convinced that growing even-aged Sitka is the only way to go forward. So there is a place for stands like that, as you'll see in a moment, but quite clearly the trend is ideally trying to encourage people to go for low impact management, continuous cover management. So yeah, there are really not many forest development types where there is not even an option for low impact management or CCF. We have, I didn't mention that, we have 61 so far, so you can kind of do the reverse conclusion. So if 42 explicitly promotes a CCF, then there is yeah, very few which are actually excluding CCF. Right, coming to a few examples. This is, of course, clearly not one of the CCF options. This is what I might describe as business as usual or tree farming Sitka. Clearly even-aged, either thinned or even unthinned. So this is what is reality in certainly a lot of UK upland forestry to date for very good historic reasons. This is also an FDT where we don't give detailed management guidelines. We thought it was sufficient to sketch out the possible development options for this stand, either originating from planting or from dense natural regeneration. So it's a simple flow chart looking at what principal measures in terms of respacing and thinning might be applied and where this is likely to end you up. So we've got the baseline, we've got respacing, thinning strategy, and then of course the management options. And we've thought we backed it up by some indication how stable the resulting stand would be in terms of stand and individual tree stability. The option is, of course, to change from one FDT to another. So to contrast the even-aged Sitka spruce, I'll show you the uneven-aged Sitka spruce. It is still only one primary species involved. They're suitable for more or less the same ecological footprint in terms of climate anyway, but also in terms of soil characteristics. So really where they two differ is the structural diversity. The second one obviously comes with a timeline, and it is much more designed to develop towards an uneven-aged stand, either simple structured or complex structured. We tried in the management timetable to care for a lot of eventualities. So this is why they appear a bit wordy in places. But if you read them carefully, well, I hope you'll find that the guidance is actually sound. A lot of it is only applicable in certain situations. And of course, I should put out that disclaimer: guidance, as I'm sure you know, this is not guidance in cooking recipe style. This is meant to be used flexibly and adapted to local site conditions. Similarly, you might look at this and say, yeah, but CCF, very often it's not a rotational or a rotation in there. Well, look at these as stages of either stand, but also as tree establishment. If you were to apply this to a single tree selection system, you would have to say, okay, young stand, that is for your recruitment of natural regeneration. And then you have your thicket stage trees, your pole stage trees, and your mature trees, which are ready for harvesting. And similarly, I've put top height here as a scale. You can translate that quite easily to individual tree height. So it may appear at first glance a bit, oh, this is the old-fashioned rotation age. Well, yes and no, it needs to be fit for rotation forestry, but it can also be applied to individual tree stages. And just moving through a few more examples, as you'll see. So this shows Sitka and Douglas fir, Sitka spruce, and other shade-tolerant conifers. They all have, the focus is very much on the CCF low impact management side of things. We've tried to make that clear by the pictograms. It's very rarely where you'll find anything where we don't anticipate any natural regeneration and no understory to develop. A couple of FDTs based on pine. Again, you've got Scots pine with shade tolerant conifers on the left, Scots pine with beech on the right. Both we have live examples which exist of these, and of course you can imagine that this is an option to actually work with these stands, using opportunities which arise naturally and by applying CCF management principles. The same is true for broadleafs. Just to contrast here a bit, there's an option for poorer sites and one for richer sites. Both are based on oak, but of course on the left, that is your typical highland or upland oak scenarios, sessile oak and birch, whereas on the right-hand side, we have the more lowland scenario, oak and long-lived broadleafs, which of course looks a bit more intriguing. It looks a bit more like a selection system, and quite clearly we really have limited the options here to CCF, either even-aged, but more likely, well, both even-aged, either single structured, but more likely to be complex structured. And yeah, on the left, an example from the Wye Valley where structures like these already exist. FDTs are embedded in tools like ecological site classification. This is a screenshot. If you go to the Forest Decision tool page of Forest Research, there is an option within the ESC tool where you can actually go for forest development types. So they are embedded in there. The outcome is slightly different to what you get from the pure species output. You are only shown suitable FDTs, so you may not get the full list of FDTs. You only get the ones which are suitable for the conditions on your reference site. But what you do get is suitability for baseline climate, that is implied anyway, but also for future climates. So it is quite a good tool to look into suitability of certain species and species combinations in future climate scenarios. Right, a bit on the general context of the project. It took off in 2018 It is funded by Forestry England and Forestry Inland Scotland. We have been working with both customers in quite a close collaboration. We got feedback from practitioners, which were implemented. The first results, so the version 1 of the flashcarding guidance, they were only delivered last autumn or last summer. And since then, we've been working to make it available in decision support tools. England and Scotland have started running practical application trials. At the moment, we are delivering a series of introductory workshops for our customers. This is actually a spin-off these workshops. And we anticipate that for the next stage of a project, we will probably have to develop training courses. We will also go for more FDTs, which we think might be required. And yeah, we are not underestimating the task. We know that climate change poses a big threat to forestry as we know it, which may be described by that photograph on the left. We also know we need to change. Climate change demands it. So we need to move to somewhere which resembles more the scenario on the right, truly mixed, truly structured, and much more resilient. So it's not something that we know we are going to achieve overnight, nor is conventional clear fell and restock management of single species going to disappear overnight. But I think we have at least got the ball rolling with coming up with a silvicultural concept which is able to show the way forward whilst not drawing an abrupt close to forest management as we know it. And with that, I think I shall stop and hand over back to Bill to moderate your questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Jens. Thank you for a very full talk. A lot in there for people to think about. And I've already got a few questions. Let me scroll through the chat. And I'll start from the top. And I think you touched on this a little bit. It's a question from Megan Curtis. Is an FDT designed to be a complete guide or framework for all potential forest management combinations, or can you broaden it if necessity arises?
It is not meant to be a silvicultural straitjacket. So yes, they are meant to be used flexibly, and they can be. I'm not saying they cannot be changed. So a lot of them, you'll notice straight away, we have been reasonably vague with species descriptions. So for example, Sitka spruce and long-lived broadleafs, that basically it leaves you all doors open what you have mixed in with your, it could be sycamore, it could be oak, it could be anything. So we've really tried to keep it flexible even by definitions. And the same is, of course, true. You could take that further if you say, yes, a certain FDTs, if you don't find an exact match, then take the nearest one and widen it out to your management objectives. There is, it's meant to work like that. So as a flexible working tool, outlining the principles of management.
Okay, thanks. I should say to the audience, if you think I haven't put the question properly, then please come back in the chat and I'll pick it up. The next one, and I know the answer to this, but I think it's maybe to do with the way the flashcards are presented. Are the FTTs solely for new forest sites, or can you use them to transform existing stands? And assuming you can you explain how you go about it?
Yes, they are meant for both scenarios. Obviously, for new forest sites, you start with a blank canvas, so you can get everything right from day one. But the idea is to use them also for transforming existing stands. And some guidance about how to go about that is in the user manual, in the FDT guide. There will of course be scenarios where you say that the changes are minor and you can achieve them gradually and hopefully by means of CCF, by underplanting, introducing additional species. And there will also be changes or envisaged changes which are a bit more drastic, where you have to say, all I can do for now is finish this rotation and create the best possible baseline condition for establishing the next FDT, which will be rather different under a CCF scenario. So there is no one universal recipe, but they are designed to be used for both scenarios, transformation as well as establishment.
In your experience, do you think it's easier for people to apply them in new planting situations than with existing stands?
I would expect so, because it's not trying to be derogatory here, but there is a bit of laziness in all of us. And if we start from scratch, it's all basically rolled out before, as we just have to follow it. There is a bit more creative thinking and a more interpretation and adaptation required when you say, well, I need to go from what is currently a pure Sitka spruce stand, and I want to make it a Sitka spruce and let's say beech. It's not quite as straightforward. Or even if you say, well, actually, I want to make it a Douglas fir and other conifers, wherever there's change of species required, this will be more complex, more challenging.
Okay, thanks. Next one is from someone who's working with Andrew Cameron in Perthshire on a transformation stand, and asking, what do you think is the big current issue in transforming stands? Is it mixed species or the issue of mixtures of ages?
I think I would say mixing species is probably the bigger challenge. We have a mixed ages. We have gathered, certainly in the last couple of decades, we have actually gathered quite some experience in how to work with natural regeneration. We have also started with underplanting. And we have some fairly good models in place now, which give us guidance and decision support how to go about ground cultivation to help natural regeneration to establish. Where I think we are lacking is really to apply that to different species, and which have different light demand, different growth rate, possibly quite different requirements with regard to soil conditions. So I would say mixing the mixed species is the bigger challenge.
Okay, thanks. Then there's one which is come from Ben Clinch, which is to do with the coding. And Ben, forgive me if I don't get this right. It's how do you store the data in subcompartment records? And have you been giving much thought to the data fields that are required to manage FDTs on a forest database and so forth?
Well, to be quite honest, we haven't. So the working group who are developing the FDTs haven't really. What we've done, we have come up with a 3-digit coding to facilitate that. But I think embedding that into subcompartment records, that will require an extra data field, but that is a task for Forestry and Land Scotland, Forestry England. So that is for the managers. We would envisage for that all you need is to come up with one additional identifier field where you say this defines the FDT, and it can be used for all kinds of data processing tasks later on. I'm the wrong person to ask about that. So I know the countries are looking at that. This is part of their trial. So I said earlier on, England and Scotland are both trialing the use of FDTs, and by that we don't mean just they are trying to transform forests. They are also trialing how the concept works with processes and procedures and things like subcompartment database. So it is being done, but I can't really say how.
Okay. Then I've got a sort of question while I draw breath and come think a little bit about which ones to take next. In the flashcards you put up, you had species proportions, sort of major, minor, and so forth, sort of, if I remember one of the examples, 50 to 70% and 20 to 30% and so forth. Are these base percentages based on stem numbers, or are they based on projected basal area of the stand as it develops? Or
yeah, it's basal area.
Right, okay.
So obviously for establishment, you would have to use a net area of what percentage you plant up with which species, but for the FDT, for the final or the long-term vision of the FDT, it is basal area.
Okay, then I've got a question which certainly beyond my competence, comes from Gail Ward, and says that aspects of the FDTs look very similar to the JNCC phase 1 system, but with more prescribed outcomes. And are there plans for it to become a survey methodology?
I have to.
Well, you could deal with the second part. Is there an intention?
What is the JNCC phase 1 system?
Gail, you could probably maybe answer that.
Hello, sorry. So the phase 1 system is the phase 1 habitat categorization. So, you know, when you initially go in and do your habitat assessment, you've got the, for example, in phase 1, you have coniferous woodland that's a plantation that is blah, 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 you know, that's 1.1.1. It's that numbering system is very similar. So what, but this now has kind of prescribed out or slightly more prescribed outcomes. Are you looking for that to become a means by which to assess woodland, either as it is, or either in a planning context, so for obviously woodland management planning, but also like planning applications, you know, whether it is going to become a survey methodology that can be utilized for lots of different aspects of woodland assessment, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Thanks, Gail. I really stumbled over the JNCC phase 1, but it's clear after your explanation. Well, we didn't even consider the JNCC phase 1 system. It just appeared to be a logical approach to us, and I would say currently we are not making plans. We really have developed this as a silvicultural tool. We are aware, though, that there is quite a range of consequences for a practical implementation. And I would certainly not rule out that if we say this is where we go, if FDTs become an element of forest design plans in the future, then yes, they need to be an element of attribute surveys or other surveys methodology. I would not rule that out. I would also say you could possibly extend that to tariff methods. So the more we move towards uneven aged and mixed stands, will have to come up with different methods of tariffing, and they could be combined with other survey like on natural regeneration, on other vegetation cover. So yes, I would say it could be a silvicultural backdrop to these methods, absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gail, for rescuing me. Next questions come from Jackie Dunn, which I think is quite interesting, which is a reminder that foresters will need to use their own interpretation of the FDT case she quotes would be, if using shade-tolerant species under oak might cause ancient woodland ground flora to be affected.
Yes, that is a fair comment, and this, of course, this will be taken on board. But I have to say, the examples, when you look at the oaks, we have not come up with any FDT which specifies oak as the main species and has a shade-tolerant conifer underneath. So there is, we are aware that broadleaf, or there are certain limits how you can mix and how you can combine broadleaf and coniferous species depending on the management objectives. I would also say you choose your FDT from your site conditions, but of course also after your management objectives. And on sites where the management objectives is, for example, a semi-ancient or ancient woodland ground, then yes, of course, there will be certain limitations. There is, for example, on the minor species, we have not specified them. But again, what we have done, we have categorized them, and we have introduced three categories, which rule out certain minor species if they either interfere with the natural growth of the primary or secondary species. In other words, if they're deemed to be invasive or too competitive, or if they're non-native. So there is quite clearly, when you choose your FDT, it is not just on site conditions. You have to look into management objectives, and for some scenarios like ancient woodland sites, SSSIs, not all FDTs will be selectable. We are aware of that, and that is fine. So I don't see really a problem there.
Okay, and then somebody who you know from the past, John Healy, I'd like to ask, he wants to ask a question about spatial scale. So John, do you want to unmute?
Yeah, hi Jens, good to see you. Okay, so mixtures is quite an important rationale for the whole typology that you've proposed. Within the context of CCF, obviously we're aware that it's not just individual tree selection systems, group felling, and so on, and group scale systems are within the remit as well. And there's quite a difference between different sort of cultures and traditions, what sort of maximum size of group could be included within the concept. So I see quite a continuity in terms of species or in terms of structure between completely uniform monocultures on a big scale, right down to systems that are at an intimate tree species mixture or tree size mixture. So I'm wondering how one would apply the typology system to the different spatial scales of mixing or stand heterogeneity. Is it quite flexible in that way, or does it present any challenges of identifying what scale of unit to apply the typology to?
Yes, thanks, John. I'm delighted you could make it onto this session.
Are you sure?
There is definition in there. There is a definition in there. It's in the user guide. We have, of course, there are several methods and tools which are a bit novel. So, for example, there is a species compatibility. We use a compatibility score which defines a bit how easy it is to grow certain species combinations together, depending on growth rate, light demand, and basically the interspecies competition. And from that score, it follows, of course, that more a mixture of species which are less compatible, where one species is likely to take over if unchecked and not monitored and intervened often enough, that this will then have to result in different mixture designs. So there is actually a table in the user guide which explains about the compatibility of tree species, and as a consequence of that, also about group size, so, and mixture type. We have basically distinguished 4 categories of mixture type: intimate, individual tree mixture, and then we distinguish between small groups, large groups, and small areas. And depending on how compatible the species are, for some combinations, we'll have to say, yes, you can actually go for fairly small groups or intimate mixtures. And in other cases, we recommend larger groups. And the categories come with definitions. I think small groups is up to 300 square meters size. So in other words, a circle with 20 meters diameter. And then the next step up is actually up to half a hectare of size. And then the largest, where we say that is in fact an area mix, it's between half and 1 hectare group size. So we have given that some thought and come up with fairly broad categories, really ranging from intimate, which could be anything, one even individual tree, but it could be very small groups of mixture.
That's fantastic.
Yeah,
Yes,
I've looked at that.
thank you.
Okay, thanks, John. Now, I think that may have touched on a question from Jack Hunt, which was where you had a forest development type that combined, for example, Scots pine and shade-tolerant conifers in the understory. Is the intention that the shade-tolerant conifers become dominant? And the subsequent question, which I think is the crux, is how is the FDT maintained over time?
Yes, that is a good question. You will find that not all of the FDTs are necessarily self-sustainable, and the Scots pine is a good example. Whether you have shade-tolerant conifers or shade-tolerant broadleafs underneath, you will find that in these FDTs, it is clearly pointed out in the management principles and in the management timetable that at some stage you will have to take a decision whether to keep working with the shade-tolerant conifers and get rid of the Scots pine, or whether you want to get rid of the shade-tolerant conifers and keep working with the Scots pine. So some FDTs, there is actually an option or a decision required at some stage where the manager simply has to say, okay, do I want to get rid of my noble fir, which is sitting underneath the Scots pine, and at a late stage when Scots pine is ready to produce sufficient viable seeds and hope for Scots pine regeneration, or am I happy to gradually phase out the Scots pine and keep working with noble fir or whatever is growing underneath? So yes, not all FDTs are necessarily self-sustaining.
Okay, so does one have a situation, maybe you said it and I missed it, that an FDT is transitional?
There are some, mainly the ones involving Corsican pine. They have deliberately being designed as transitional FDTs. So for these, as we currently expect that we will have to phase out Corsican pine as a primary species, it may not disappear altogether, but at the moment, Corsican pine types, they have all been designed as a transition type. So the implication there is, yes, at some stage, you will have to decide what you want to change your Corsican pine into. But yes, the FDT is, it's not set in stone in a way that it can never ever change. So yes, some of the FDTs could be seen as transition types where you say, this is the target for the current crop, and after that we'll set a new target. That is an option for, not for all of them, but for some.
Okay, we've got a few questions now, which will mean jumping a bit about a bit, so I hope you're feeling mentally agile. The first is an observation from Adam, who asked one of the earlier questions. And he's wondered, he comments there could be a huge opportunity for an online sharing, knowledge sharing platform between practitioners using the FDT framework to share approaches, challenges, and successes. And is there any plans to develop something like this?
This is the first time that this idea is really addressed explicitly. I have to say, yes, I agree. There is an opportunity, and we have, of course, well, we have built a website. We have got an email address where all queries, all feedback is supposed to be directed to. And of course, we could develop that further and say this is becoming the sharing platform. And I'd be quite delighted if it was actually evolved further by not just the main customers, state forest services, but also the private sector. I think this is a good opportunity, and we should go into that direction. Well, as I said, we have got the rudimentary, so we've got the website in place, and the platform is there. It is not particularly structured for that purpose, so that is something that would still have to be developed. But we'd certainly, I think we'd be very open to that suggestion.
Okay, thanks. Then next one is, to what extent, if you look at Britain as a whole, do you see that this approach is relevant throughout, or are there parts of Britain where it's likely to have more impact because these are areas which are under low impact management already?
Well, I said it will not necessarily progress everywhere with the same pace. But so straight away you could say, and I get very much of that from the webinars for England and Scotland. There's much keener interest in England, where you can simply say, well, that's because climate change issues are much more pressing there, whereas Scotland can afford to wait a little longer and say, yeah, we'll see how things pan out. I would say, however, the climate change is really, that is what forces us to act. That doesn't mean in other areas where we do low impact management already, we cannot adopt the same concept and say, actually, it will be, we can take a much more relaxed, there's maybe less pressure to adopt the FDT system, but that doesn't mean it cannot be adopted, and it will not necessarily be useful. So I think for low impact management, you will still find that it is quite easy, even for low impact management forestry, which is in place already. You can still identify fairly easily an appropriate or adequate FDT, which actually mirrors what you're doing already. And you have then you're in the enviable position not having to change anything. You just say, well, I'm running FDT 112 and have been doing so for 20 years already.
Okay. We've got a couple of questions now which touch on to the implications of using FTTs and by extension CCF for forest mensuration and production forecasting. And how's this going to be handled, either in the public sector or in the private sector?
I think there is, I see a task for forest research there. We know that our current tariffing methods, they're geared for even-aged single species stands. And the more we diversify, the less accurate our current tariff methods will be. So yes, we'll have to adapt, we'll have to move on with our tariffing methods. I don't think that is an unsurmountable task either, because there are other countries in the world, and particularly in Central Europe, where this has been done for decades. So the methods are there. It is just adopting these, making them fit for purpose. But I don't think that we have to start from scratch again. It's just it's a question of, yes, realizing what a suitable methodology is for forest mensuration, for tariffing, for production forecast, and then adopting a system which has already been tried and tested elsewhere. So I don't think that is, it just more requires the will to do that rather than technical difficulties to overcome.
Right. Okay, so do I take it from what you said that these discussions are at an early stage as to how they could be linked into a production forecasting system?
Well, they are, and we can only do one step after another, and we thought the first one is actually to come up with a silvicultural system, that a silvicultural approach that is likely to work, that is sustainable in management. So everything else has to follow, has to fall in place, into place from that. So yeah, at the moment we are not looking at these things yet, but I can also assure you in today's webinar for Forest Services England, that came out quite clearly, and someone immediately suggested, well, why don't we adjust one of the forest simulating tools which are in use on the continent for production forecast, and they are used for mixed stands, for uneven aged stands over there. So it goes into the same direction as we were with tariffing. So the tools are there or are being developed. It is really just a question of are we happy to acquire them and adapt them to our needs and specific purposes.
Okay. Then there's a question. We're nearly at the end. You'll be so you don't feel too exhausted. In your reply to John Healy, you were talking about group felling areas and mixture sizes and so forth. And Jonathan's asked, can you clarify the point about diversifying stands and prescribing a maximum group felling area of 0.5 hectare? And is this based on continental experience or more on first principles?
This is more based on principles, ecological principles. I have to say the area guidance we did derive from continental guidance, so it is no different in the German template what we use. They too, and the largest mixture group scale is actually 0.5 to 1 hectare size. And whether this still qualifies as CCF or even as low impact management system is a different question. So I said early on, it is not entirely about CCF or low impact management. We actually do assume that to some degree patch clear felling will remain to be used. And you could quite clearly say, yeah, group felling of 0.5 hectare, okay, we cannot call that CCF or even low impact, but it is a viable strategy. And compared to, let's say, the 20 or 50 hectare clear fells, which we are still carrying out in production forestry in some parts of the country, I would say if we manage to go down to 0.5 hectare, that is a big step forward.
Yeah, but thanks, and I agree, but the first principles that say limit the size to 0.5 to 0.5 hectare or a hectare, is this based on partly on the loss, assuming a loss of forest microclimate and environment beyond a certain size?
Well, I don't want to be too nitpicking about this, but the sheer size does not necessarily give us conclusions for the climate, because it's the shape also matters. So you can have quite easily a 0.5 hectare sized gap, which is still only 20 meters wide, and you therefore retain the forest climate.
Okay. Right. Well, we're just gone 5. I think 5 past 5. And We've had a really good expose, I think would be the appropriate word here, of forest development types and their future role in British forestry and the link to CCF. I'd like to thank you very much, Jens, for taking the time to put this together. And I know it was quite hard because you had to shorten your standard presentation quite appreciably. So on behalf of the group and the attendees, thanks very much.